An amazing new video shows the thought racing across the surface of the human brain in less than a second. Experts tracked the path of singular thoughts through people's minds as they underwent open brain surgery. Electrodes were hooked directly to the surface of each patient's white matter, taking readings while they completed a simple call and response task. The scans show clearly how the brain acts in response to sight and sounds, which scientists say could explain why we say things before we think. Experts asked people to repeat the word humid. The brain's language center is shown lighting up, in yellow, as it received the word, while a bit of cortex, blue, then fires as the brain plans a response. The prefrontal cortex, red, informed the response before it was given. The researchers, from the University of California, Berkeley, said the recordings could help us better understand how the brain's frontal lobe, known as the prefrontal cortex, acts as the brain's conductor. We are trying to look at that little window of time between when things happen in the environment and us behaving in response to it, lead author Dr. Augusta Sheshtuk said. This is the first step in looking at how people think and how people come up with different decisions, how people basically behave. The study involved 16 epilepsy patients whose minds needed to be examined to better understand their seizures. Hundreds of electrodes were attached directly to the brain's surface during open surgery in a process called electrocorticography. Participants were asked to perform one of several tasks while researchers closely monitored their brains. In the clip, scientists asked people to repeat the word humid. The brain's language center is shown lighting up as it received the word, while a bit of cortex then fires as the brain plans a response. Before the patient had repeated the word, the prefrontal cortex, which is heavily involved in planning, can be seen making calculations to inform the response. All of this coordinated activity occurred in less than a second, the researchers said. For a more difficult task like coming up with the opposite to a word, for example, responding to humid with dry, the brain required several seconds to reply. For a more difficult task like coming up with the opposite to a word, for example, responding to humid with dry, the brain required several seconds to reply. Pictured is a scan as a patient attempted one of these antonym tasks. During this time, the prefrontal cortex recruited other areas of the brain, including presumably memory networks not visible in the scan, the scientists said. Only then did the prefrontal cortex hand off to a different brain region to generate a spoken response known as the motor cortex. The researchers found that the brain began to prepare the motor areas to respond very early. This suggests we get ready to respond even before we know what the response will be. This might explain why people sometimes say things before they think, said Dr. Sheshtuk. The findings, including the key role played by the prefrontal cortex in coordinating our white matter, line up with previous theories about the brain's frontal lobe. These very selective studies have found that the frontal cortex is the orchestrator, linking things together for a final output, said co-author Professor Robert Knight. Here we have 8 different experiments, some where the patients have to talk and others where they have to push a button, where some are visual and others auditory, and all found a universal signature of activity centered in the prefrontal lobe that links perception and action. It's the glue of cognition.